In the quiet harbor of Southampton, the sun rose softly over the calm waters. It was April 10, 1912. The town stirred gently as dock workers moved crates and cargo with unhurried care. The stillness of the morning was only broken by the creaking of ropes and the occasional call of a seagull drifting in the morning light. There she stood, the RMS Titanic. A graceful giant resting in peaceful slumber before her first and only voyage. Her hull gleamed with fresh black paint, her 4 grand smokestacks reaching into the pale blue sky. Passengers gathered slowly, wrapped in coats and shawls, their footsteps echoing quietly on the wooden dock. Children clutched their parents' hands. Gentle waves lapped at the sides of the ship. Luggage carts rolled steadily, wheels humming on stone. There was no rush. No panic. Just the measured calm of anticipation. Cabin stewards stood politely at the gangways, offering a warm welcome with a tip of the hat. Porters lifted bags with practiced ease. The first-class passengers, adorned in elegant travel attire, smiled softly as they stepped aboard, while third-class families clung to one another, whispering dreams of a new life in America. The ship's interiors glowed softly with the polished sheen of new mahogany. The grand staircase sparkled beneath a domed skylight. Everything was clean, pristine, and still, like a dream waiting to unfold. In a first-class stateroom, a young woman named Eleanor adjusted her gloves as her husband read quietly by the window. In third class, a group of Irish immigrants settled into their bunks, exchanging small stories and kind glances, their voices low and kind. The Titanic's engines remained still for now, humming quietly with potential energy. Crew members walked the decks, adjusting ropes and checking railings with steady, silent precision. Somewhere below, coal dust settled in the engine rooms where stokers waited for the captain's orders. The harbor breeze carried with it the faint scent of salt, coal smoke, and fresh flowers packed into baskets. A little girl pointed up at the towering funnels and whispered, "She looks like a castle." And indeed, she did. From the bridge, Captain Edward Smith watched the final preparations. His hands clasped gently behind his back. His expression was calm, seasoned. This was to be his last voyage before retirement, and he hoped it would be a peaceful one. The clock chimed 9. By noon, the Titanic would pull away from the dock with a slow and elegant motion. For now, though, the ship rested quietly in Southampton's embrace. The excitement was tempered by calm. The movement was measured. Everything felt suspended in time. Aboard the Titanic, soft piano music drifted from the first-class lounge, a quiet melody echoing through the marbled halls. Tea was being served with gentle clinks of porcelain and silver spoons. On deck, a few passengers sipped warm drinks, wrapped in coats against the soft morning chill. The ship was alive, but barely breathing. Like a gentle giant waiting to dream. Soon she would glide across the ocean's glassy surface. But now, she waited, serene, undisturbed. And in this moment of stillness, the Titanic became more than a ship. She became a memory in the making. A floating world wrapped in quiet anticipation. A gentle promise carried on the sea breeze. A night of calm reflection, yet to begin. The soft hum of voices filled the air as passengers found their places, and the Titanic began to stir beneath them. It was just after noon when the gangways were lifted. The mooring lines were loosened. The grand ship let out a low, melodic horn, not sharp or startling, but deep and resonant, like a slow exhale echoing across the harbor. The calm waters of Southampton shimmered beneath a gray-blue sky, brushed with sunlight. Small boats bobbed in the gentle wake as the Titanic slowly pulled away from the dock. People on shore waved handkerchiefs and raised hats. Farewells were whispered, not shouted, and tears shimmered quietly in a few eyes, tears of hope, of new beginnings, of unknown futures. From the railings, passengers leaned with serene curiosity. Eleanor stood with her husband on the upper deck, the breeze playing softly with the ribbon of her hat. She looked back at the disappearing port, fingers gently wrapped around the cold metal railing, heart beating quietly with anticipation. Below them, third-class families stood shoulder to shoulder, faces filled with awe. They had never seen a ship so grand, nor a moment so full of promise. The Titanic's engines now turned with grace, each vibration flowing through the deck like the calm pulse of a sleeping giant. The ship glided forward with poise, not racing, not rushing, simply and confidently moving out to sea. Tugs guided her gently, and the ship obeyed with silent dignity. On board, the mood remained soft and composed. The crew moved with practiced precision, assisting passengers, guiding them with polite nods and kind words. No one hurried. There was time to explore, time to settle in, time to breathe. From the promenade deck, the English countryside slowly rolled out of view, replaced by the open channel and the light scent of salt water. A choir of seabirds accompanied the journey's beginning, their wings catching the sunlight in shimmering arcs. Inside, the dining saloons were slowly filling for lunch. Waiters glided from table to table with linen-draped arms. Silverware gleamed, and low conversation hummed like a lullaby. No loud laughter, no disorder, just the calm rhythm of a voyage beginning with dignity. Down below, in the third-class dining area, there was warmth and comfort too. Simple meals were served with care, and people smiled over shared tables. For many, this was the finest journey they had ever taken. The Titanic was a floating city, but it carried itself with the tranquility of a village. A little boy named Thomas sat beside his mother, watching the ship's slow movement through a porthole. "Are we flying?" he asked in a soft voice. His mother chuckled quietly, smoothing his hair. "Not quite," she whispered. "But it does feel like we are." The sky began to change. Afternoon sun glowed gold across the decks. Shadows stretched and softened. The sea rolled beneath them like a calm lullaby, slow, rhythmic, and endlessly deep. Captain Smith walked the bridge with his officers, each movement calm, each instruction measured. No drama. No surprises. Just the steady start of a journey across the Atlantic. In the engine rooms far below, coal was shoveled with rhythm and respect. The ship responded like a living thing, steady, powerful, composed. As evening approached, the Titanic arrived at Cherbourg, her first stop. Lights on the dock twinkled like stars. More passengers came aboard. Luggage was loaded with careful hands. Among them, a man named André stepped on deck and looked up with quiet wonder at the ship's size. He smiled to himself, letting the salty breeze kiss his face. "A calm night," he whispered. And it was. The stars began to twinkle above. The sea became silk under a navy sky. Lamps lit softly throughout the ship, glowing amber through frosted glass. The Titanic was no longer just a ship, she was a floating lantern, drifting peacefully through the coming night. As the ship pulled away once more, a stillness fell over the decks. People settled into their rooms, unpacking slowly, speaking in hushed tones. Some stepped onto the promenade to look at the stars, each breath visible in the cool night air. The ocean stretched endlessly before them. But the night was gentle. And so, with grace and silence, the Titanic slipped farther from shore. Into the quiet embrace of the Atlantic. The night wrapped itself gently around the Titanic, as though the sky had drawn a soft blanket over the sea. There was no wind, no storm. Only stillness. The ship moved through the water with such grace that it felt as though she were gliding rather than sailing. Above, the sky was a quiet ocean of stars. Countless points of light shimmered high above the masts. The moon, a slender crescent, cast a pale glow upon the ship's white upper decks. The water below reflected the stars, creating the illusion that the Titanic sailed between two skies, one above and one below. Passengers stood at the railings, quietly admiring the view. Some whispered, not wanting to disturb the sacred hush of the open sea at night. The ocean seemed endless, like a peaceful void, carrying the ship forward with quiet determination. In the first-class lounge, the piano played softly. A gentle waltz drifted into the air, barely above a whisper. Women in soft silk dresses leaned into conversations with quiet laughter. Men swirled brandy in their glasses, speaking in low, thoughtful tones. No grand statements. No demands. Only presence. Only quiet. Eleanor sat on a velvet chair, sipping tea from a fine porcelain cup. The warmth of the tea mixed with the stillness of the room to create a deep sense of calm. She turned the pages of a book slowly, her eyes lifting now and then to gaze through the wide windows at the starlit sea. In second class, a group of travelers from Boston played cards in a softly lit room. Their voices were warm but restrained, and the sound of shuffling cards was almost meditative. They spoke of home, of business, of the cities they'd left behind, all in hushed tones that echoed with sleepiness. Down in third class, children had long since fallen asleep in their bunks. Mothers rocked infants gently, their breath steady and deep. The hum of the engines was soothing. Not a disturbance, but a lullaby from deep within the ship's heart. The rhythm of motion, the subtle sway of the ship, the softness of shared space, all of it wove into a peaceful dream. A steward, lantern in hand, made his rounds along the corridor. His steps were careful, his touch gentle as he closed a window or adjusted a blanket. He knew the ship was more than metal and wood. It was a world afloat, and tonight, it was a world at peace. On the upper decks, few remained awake. A couple leaned against the railing, bundled in wool coats, saying little. Just watching the sky. The man whispered, "It's as though we're alone on Earth." And in a way, they were. The sea was vast and empty. No lights from other ships, no clouds, no noise. Only the distant breathing of the ocean. Gentle. Eternal. A cat in the crew's quarters stretched and curled near a warm pipe, content in the silence. Somewhere in the galley, the last dishes of the day were washed, the clinking of plates softened by distance and steel. The Titanic was alive, but dreaming. Each light in each window was a heartbeat. Each sleeping soul, a star aboard this floating sky. Captain Smith sat in his quarters for a moment, reviewing the charts. His hand moved slowly across the map. No storms ahead. No dangers expected. His eyes drifted toward the dark window. "She sails well," he said aloud, almost to himself. Then he stood, turned off the lamp, and stepped quietly into the hallway, boots echoing lightly. Below deck, in the engine room, the firemen worked in silence. The glow of the furnaces cast orange halos on their faces. The sound of coal shoveling, the hiss of steam, the gentle turning of gears, it was a quiet symphony of motion. Not frantic. Not fierce. Just steady. Just calm. The night deepened. Stars thickened. The sea darkened into velvet. All across the ship, people drifted into slumber. A gentle rhythm of breath filled every room. Dreams flickered behind closed eyes, of home, of love, of distant shores. And the Titanic moved on. Majestic. Silent. Wrapped in the arms of the Atlantic. Cradled by night. Rocked by time. A world asleep. A dream afloat. As the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the Titanic moved steadily through calm waters. A soft hush still blanketed the decks, broken only by the gentle sound of waves brushing the hull and the low hum of distant engines deep within the ship's core. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky had begun to lighten, shifting from inky blue to a faint silver gray. Stars still glowed faintly overhead as if reluctant to leave. The night was ending slowly, respectfully, as if bowing out of a graceful performance. A few early risers stepped onto the promenade deck, wrapped in shawls and coats. Their breath hung visibly in the crisp morning air. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, calm and glassy. Not a ripple disturbed the surface, only the quiet, effortless trail left by the Titanic's passage. Stewards moved quietly through corridors and cabins, beginning their morning tasks. Doors opened with soft clicks. Fireplaces were lit in the lounges, and silver breakfast trays were carried with care. No shouting, no hurry. Just the calm rhythm of another day at sea. Eleanor opened her curtains to the growing light and took a deep breath. The view was stunning, nothing but open ocean and the pale blush of morning. Her husband was still asleep, and she took a moment to sit at the small writing desk by the window, pen in hand, gently drafting a letter to her sister back home. "Dearest Clara," she wrote, "the sea is the softest shade of blue this morning, and the air smells of salt and peace. It feels like we're floating in a dream. I wish you could see this." In the first-class dining saloon, the morning service began with gentle music from a string quartet. Tables were adorned with white linen, fine china, and polished silver. Guests arrived in twos and threes, some chatting quietly, others simply enjoying the warmth of fresh tea or the scent of buttered toast. On the boat deck, a few passengers walked slowly, their footsteps muted against the wooden planks. An elderly gentleman leaned on his cane and gazed out to sea. A young girl twirled her gloves in her hands, occasionally glancing at the sky, whispering to herself as if speaking to the clouds. Down in second class, the morning was no less peaceful. The dining room was filled with the smell of porridge and fresh rolls. People spoke softly about their dreams from the night before, or what they hoped to see in New York. A man read his pocket Bible, the pages thin and worn, but held with reverent care. In third class, breakfast was simpler but no less satisfying: thick bread, warm tea, and laughter passed quietly between families. The children awoke slowly, rubbing eyes and yawning as they sat at the benches, the motion of the ship lulling them like a cradle. A woman from Sweden stood at a small porthole, brushing her daughter's hair as the child stared out at the sea. "Do you think there are fish that never sleep?" the little girl asked, and her mother smiled. "I think the sea watches over tea." "Them," she replied gently. The crew moved through the ship with quiet focus. The baker kneaded dough in his kitchen, the purser checked his ledgers, and the wireless operators tapped messages back and forth to the mainland, greetings, reports, and updates sent like birds flying invisibly through the sky. The Titanic sailed forward, steady and strong. Her hull cut the water like a whisper, and her wake unfurled behind her like a silk ribbon. The day was peaceful, and every detail aboard reflected that calm. From polished brass fixtures to folded napkins, from soft towels to shining railings, everything was part of a floating world crafted for elegance and ease. Eleanor stepped outside after breakfast and found a quiet bench. She sat with a book in her lap, though she barely read. Her eyes wandered to the horizon, where the pale sky met the endless blue of the sea. Seagulls followed the ship at a distance, their cries soft and infrequent. She closed her eyes for a moment and simply listened, to the rustle of flags, the distant echo of footsteps, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the engines far below. Peace. All around her, it was peace. And beneath it all, a deep sense of trust in the ship, in the voyage, in the future. The Titanic continued her path westward, gliding through morning light, her decks alive with quiet purpose, her passengers wrapped in contentment. By mid-morning, the Titanic was surrounded by open sea in every direction. The weather remained mild, the breeze soft and salty, and the ship glided onward as if moved by a gentle hand. No clouds drifted across the sky, and the sun warmed the decks without harshness, a perfect day at sea. The ship's size continued to amaze. Even for those who had been aboard for over a day, it still felt like a small city, yet one that moved with surprising quietness and poise. Elevators glided silently between floors. Hallways echoed with nothing more than soft footsteps and the polite murmur of conversation. On the boat deck, groups of passengers walked arm in arm, taking in the vastness of the ocean. Children played near the railings under the watchful eyes of nurses and governesses. A few elderly travelers sat in wicker chairs, wrapped in lap blankets, reading or simply staring into the blue. Eleanor and her husband took their morning stroll after tea, hand in hand. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke, but not unpleasantly so. It was the scent of travel, of motion, of the ocean. "I wonder how deep the sea is right now," she mused softly. Her husband replied with a smile, "Deep enough to carry our dreams." They paused to admire the view. The Titanic's wake rippled outward in long white trails, dissolving into the glassy surface. Seabirds drifted lazily above, and now and then, a dolphin's sleek back could be spotted breaking the waterline in a smooth, fleeting arc. Down in the gymnasium, some first-class passengers tried the modern exercise machines, an electric camel ride, a mechanical rowing device. The instructor gave brief demonstrations with a calm and cheerful voice, careful not to disturb the tranquility of the day. In the Turkish baths, steam rose in thin clouds while voices remained hushed. The warm tiles and gentle heat made everything feel slower, more peaceful. Some drifted into brief naps, towels wrapped around their heads, the outside world forgotten entirely. Lunchtime brought a different kind of stillness, that of quiet enjoyment. The dining rooms filled again, but there was no clatter or chaos. Every movement was measured. Waiters moved between tables like dancers, and silver cutlery met porcelain with the gentlest clinks. On her plate, Eleanor found a single violet tucked beside a slice of poached salmon, a small, beautiful touch that made her smile. Across the table, her husband raised his cup and said, "To our voyage, and the calm seas that carry us." Elsewhere on the ship, people found their own rhythms. A violinist played softly in a corner of the second-class library. A group of young men from Scotland played chess near a sunlit window. Down in third class, a boy strummed a tune on a borrowed fiddle, and others tapped their feet gently, clapping along without disturbing those resting nearby. The crew kept everything in smooth order. Cabin stewards freshened linens and straightened up with quiet efficiency. The cooks prepared the next meal below deck, filling the air with the comforting aroma of fresh bread. The officers paced the bridge, checking course and wind direction, their words few but precise. At mid-afternoon, a tea service was offered across the ship. Scones, jam, and delicate sandwiches appeared on shining trays. Cups clinked gently. Laughter rose here and there but always in soft waves, never loud, never harsh. Later, as the sun began its descent, casting gold across the waves, passengers gathered once again along the rails. The sea, ever loyal, remained smooth. The breeze carried the warmth of the day into the evening. Someone remarked that the water looked like silk, smooth and endless. A steward handed Eleanor a shawl as the temperature dropped slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, wrapping it around her shoulders. Below, the sun touched the edge of the world, and its light bled into pinks and oranges. The sky transformed, and the ship glowed in its embrace. Children were led inside. Deck chairs were folded. Lamps began to glow behind frosted glass. The ocean faded into dark blue. And the Titanic, steady and grand, continued onward, leaving only the softest trace behind her. It had been a day of quiet luxury, of stillness, of comfort. A day where time stretched gently, where hearts slowed, and where the sea whispered promises of safe passage. As darkness returned, so did the stars, one by one, as if returning to a familiar stage. And as passengers prepared for another calm night aboard, many paused to take one last look at the horizon. As twilight melted into night once again, the RMS Titanic was enveloped by a quiet that stretched beyond the ship and into the horizon. The sky above was ablaze with stars, millions of them, scattered like soft diamonds over deep indigo velvet. There was no moon, but the starlight was so pure, so plentiful, that the ocean below seemed lit from within. The sea remained perfectly still. So still, in fact, that it mirrored the sky, creating an illusion of sailing through space rather than water. The Titanic was a vessel adrift among stars, her lights glowing softly, her decks gently alive with quiet footsteps and murmured words. Eleanor stood again on the upper deck, wrapped in her shawl. Beside her, her husband pointed upward toward a constellation. "That's Orion," he whispered. "He's hunting forever, even out here." She smiled, her breath visible in the chill. "I think he's watching over us," she replied. Other passengers gathered too. Not in noisy clusters, but in scattered pairs and thoughtful individuals. Some leaned on railings. Others sat quietly with blankets over their laps, gazing upward in reverence. A steward passed with a tray of warm drinks, offering cocoa and brandy, his voice low and kind. In the first-class smoking room, men played cards under low golden lights. The room smelled of tobacco and wood polish. The conversation was sparse, quiet remarks about business or family, told with that same low tone that seemed to echo the softness of the sea itself. Further below, in second class, the piano played again, this time a slow nocturne, its notes floating like mist through the hallway. A young woman sang softly under her breath as she stitched a hem near the stairway. No one disturbed her. Her voice, like everything else aboard, became part of the calm. Down in third class, families tucked their children in once more. Soft lullabies in Irish, Swedish, and Italian mingled quietly with the creak of bunks and the sigh of steam pipes. Mothers kissed foreheads. Fathers held little hands until sleep returned. A steward walked slowly through the corridors with his lantern, casting golden halos against the metal walls. Occasionally, he paused to close a vent or draw a curtain. His footsteps were even, like the ticking of a peaceful clock. On the bridge, Captain Smith conferred softly with his officers. The course remained clear. No ships in sight. The air was cold but still. The stars above blinked in steady silence, and the compass needle pointed true. The ship moved at speed, but there was no rush, only purpose. Only stillness. Somewhere, a door creaked gently open and shut. A pair of lovers strolled in the open air. They said little. They didn't need to. Their closeness, their shared silence, said everything. Behind them, the Titanic's lights shimmered faintly in the polished brass and dark wood. Elegance at rest. A cat belonging to one of the crew padded softly down a hallway near the kitchens, pausing at a corner before curling up beside a warm pipe. She yawned and blinked slowly before tucking her head beneath her paw. Back in her stateroom, Eleanor sat at her dressing table, brushing her hair in long, deliberate strokes. Each motion was slow and thoughtful. Outside the small window, the stars continued to shine. She could hear nothing, not even the engines now. Only the occasional creak of wood or the soft crackle of a lamp. She laid her brush aside, pulled the covers around her, and reached for her journal. By the dim light of the bedside lamp, she wrote. "There is peace aboard this ship like I have never known. Not a peace born of silence, but of presence. Of gentle motion. The stars feel close tonight. Almost as though they're watching us from just above the mast." Outside her room, the world continued to drift by, an ocean wrapped in starlight, and a ship wrapped in dreams. From above, the Titanic looked like a floating constellation of her own, drifting through the Atlantic darkness. No shouting, no panic. Only breath, only sleep, only the slow beating of a steel heart. And so, night deepened. The sea held its peace. The sky held its wonder. And aboard the great ship, sleep returned again, soft, slow, and safe. A lullaby in the language of water and light. A quiet reflection upon the edge of the world. The morning of April 14, 1912, arrived with a delicate hush. The sky was painted in pale pinks and cool blues, the kind of morning that inspired quiet reflection rather than excitement. The Titanic, now days into her voyage, glided effortlessly through the North Atlantic. The sea remained calm, mirror-like, without a single wave to break its surface. Sunlight filtered softly through the stateroom curtains. Eleanor awoke slowly, blinking at the golden light that touched her face. The rhythmic hum of the engines beneath her bed was a gentle reminder that they were still moving, still safe, still far from shore yet never feeling lost. She dressed in soft fabrics and stepped out onto the promenade, where a few early risers already walked in pairs. The ship's motion was so smooth that it felt almost unreal, like being carried by air. Her husband joined her shortly, and they took a slow walk around the deck, savoring the cool, refreshing air. Church bells did not ring aboard the Titanic, but the spirit of Sunday was still present. People spoke in softer voices. There was no rush for breakfast. Everything moved slower, more reverently. Even the ship's crew, usually brisk and busy, seemed to take a gentler pace. A church service was held in the first-class dining saloon that morning. Captain Smith himself attended. Passengers filled the chairs with quiet dignity, hymnbooks in hand. The service was simple: scripture, a few well-known hymns, a prayer for safe passage. The organist played softly, and voices joined together, not loudly, but with a calm, steady reverence. Eleanor sat near the middle row, her hands folded, eyes closed as the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," filled the room. The music did not echo, it flowed gently through the saloon like a stream, touching hearts, drawing quiet tears from some, and gentle smiles from others. In second class, a smaller service took place in the library, equally heartfelt. Children sat beside their parents, heads bowed, hands clasped. Some whispered along with the hymns. Some simply listened. Down in third class, families gathered for their own simple devotions. A priest, traveling with a group of Irish immigrants, read verses aloud while others sang softly in Gaelic. The scent of fresh bread and boiled tea drifted through the hallways, adding to the warm, peaceful stillness. The Titanic, massive and magnificent, carried thousands, yet on this Sunday morning, it felt like a single family floating through the sea together. After the service, passengers returned to the decks. The air had warmed just slightly. The sun sparkled across the ocean, which continued to remain uncannily smooth. The crew remarked on it, like glass, they said. Eerily still. But no one worried. It only added to the dreamlike beauty of the day. Eleanor sat beneath a deck awning, a blanket draped across her lap, writing postcards. She paused often, her eyes drifting out to sea. Each word she wrote felt deliberate, unhurried. The ship was not just transporting her across an ocean, it was giving her space to think, to rest, to reflect. In the afternoon, there was tea and soft conversation in the lounges. Someone played a quiet tune on the piano again, and a young woman sang a gentle lullaby in French, her voice almost a whisper. Nearby, an older couple sat in silence, fingers laced together, eyes closed. The day passed without incident. The Titanic was a perfect host, offering beauty, comfort, and a strange sense of timelessness. At one point, Eleanor turned to her husband and said, "I feel like we've always been on this ship." He nodded. "And I wouldn't mind if we always were." By evening, the sky once again darkened, stars blooming above the dark ocean. The temperature began to drop. There was talk of cooler weather ahead. "We'll pass through ice fields tonight," someone mentioned at dinner, casually. "Nothing dangerous. Just a bit colder." But no one felt concern. After all, the Titanic was invincible, so they were told. The ship of dreams. The queen of the sea. She had already weathered fog and cold. Ice was just another detail of the ocean story. As night fell, passengers settled in once more. Children slept quickly, comforted by the routine of the voyage. Adults lingered in lounges, reading or playing cards, always with that same sense of relaxed ease. The sea beneath them remained still. The stars above, endless. And in the middle of it all, a floating world, golden lit and wrapped in silence. The Titanic sailed on. Unaware of what the night would bring. But wrapped, for now, in peace. The final light of April 14th settled gently over the Atlantic like a soft veil. As the sun dipped below the horizon, it left behind a lingering glow, warm, tender, almost hesitant to fade. The Titanic moved steadily through the still waters, her reflection perfect in the sea's glassy surface. Even the wind had gone quiet. There was barely a breeze. The ship, vast as it was, felt like a silent glider, coasting through a realm untouched by time. Passengers remarked again on the stillness of the water. Some found it beautiful. Others, strangely unsettling. But mostly, it was taken as a gift, an offering of peace from the ocean itself. Eleanor stood once more on the deck, watching the day dissolve into twilight. She could hear only the soft click of a nearby officer's shoes, the rustle of her own coat, and the distant, ever-steady hum of the ship's engines. Dinner that evening was exquisite, yet serene. In the first-class dining saloon, candlelight flickered gently on polished silver. Glasses clinked softly. Plates were served with quiet grace. Conversation remained low and unhurried. Eleanor and her husband sat at a small table near a porthole. She sipped a warm consommé, the steam curling delicately upward. He admired the way the candlelight caught the edge of her eyes. Around them, laughter echoed gently, never loud, just little ripples of warmth. Further down in second class, the mood was just as relaxed. Groups chatted over hearty meals, with cups of tea and simple desserts to follow. In third class, families shared bread and soup in a cozy, communal dining space. The atmosphere was one of contentment, of being cared for. Of floating together in peace. After dinner, many passengers returned to the deck to take in the night air. It was noticeably colder. Breath turned to mist. Coats were pulled tighter. Still, the beauty of the night drew them out. The stars had returned in full. Clearer than ever. Brighter. Unblinking. So many that the sky seemed to shimmer. The sea responded in kind, perfectly mirroring each star, each glimmer. It was as if the Titanic had been lifted out of the world and placed gently into another, a place of stillness, light, and dark in perfect balance. The ship's band played in the lounge, a waltz, followed by a gentle ragtime tune. People swayed in rhythm, some simply listening, their hands around warm drinks, their eyes half closed with comfort. Someone requested "Autumn," and the band obliged with soft harmonies that wrapped the listeners in nostalgic calm. In her stateroom, Eleanor changed into a heavier robe. She rubbed her hands together, smiling at the coolness. She opened her small window briefly and let the night air touch her cheeks. It was cold. Much colder than the nights before. The kind of cold that carried silence with it. A vast, echoing kind of silence. Elsewhere, the officers on the bridge noted the temperature drop. One mentioned that the sea had grown unusually calm. Another pointed out that ice warnings had come in from other ships earlier. But no one sounded alarmed. It was simply part of the crossing, something to watch, not something to fear. At 10 p.m., stewards made their final rounds. They offered hot water bottles, turned down beds, and whispered goodnights. In third class, parents tucked their children beneath thick blankets. In second class, travelers organized their suitcases for the next day's dressing. In first class, the lights dimmed to a soft amber hue. Eleanor wrote one final postcard before sleep. The sea is quieter than I've ever known. It feels as though we are floating through a dream, caught between sky and water, the lines between them completely gone. I've never felt farther from land, or more at peace. By 11 p.m., most of the ship was asleep. The only sounds were the gentle churn of the ship's engines, the occasional soft creak of wood, and the distant bell on the bridge, marking time, hour by hour. The Titanic sailed on, unaware. The stars looked down, clear and cold. The sea stretched out in silence, black and endless. And every soul aboard slept soundly, cradled by steel and faith. It was the last hour of absolute calm. The final breath before the world would change. But in that moment, nothing stirred. Nothing broke the peace. Not yet. The ship's clocks marked 11:30 p.m. All across the Titanic, silence had fully taken hold. In the first-class corridors, lights glowed dim behind etched glass doors. In third class, entire families lay curled together beneath thick woolen blankets, their soft breathing the only sound. The entire vessel felt wrapped in a hush deeper than sleep, a stillness that felt sacred. Outside, the air had turned sharper, colder than any night before. It moved like ice against the skin. Breath hung visibly in the air even on the sheltered promenade decks. Yet the ocean remained motionless. So still, in fact, that many remarked on it. No waves, no foam, just a black mirror stretching endlessly in every direction. The stars shone with chilling clarity. The sky seemed closer than ever, impossibly full. For those who remained awake, it was a view unlike anything they had ever seen. The sea, without wind or current, looked like polished obsidian, dotted with reflections of ancient light. In the crow's nest, two lookouts scanned the horizon, their eyes watering in the bitter cold. They stamped their feet, wrapped scarves tighter around their necks. "Can't see much tonight," one murmured. "Too calm. Too dark." The other nodded. "It's like floating in nothing," he replied. Below, on the bridge, the officers stood quietly, their coats buttoned high. The ship continued at speed, a steady 22 knots, gliding smoothly across the invisible ice-cold sea. A few ice warnings sat in the message box, received throughout the day. But the course had not changed. It was clear. All seemed well. At 11:40 p.m., the lookout's voice rang through the telephone from the crow's nest. "Iceberg, right ahead." His voice was not panicked, just firm, focused. Trained. The bridge officers moved instantly, but with controlled urgency. Orders were given, hard to starboard. Engines reversed. The crew, highly trained, responded without chaos. There was no shouting. Just action. But it was too late. The iceberg loomed suddenly out of the dark, pale and silent, nearly invisible against the black sea. Titanic began to turn, slowly, and for a moment, it seemed she might miss it. Then came a long, low scrape. Not a crash. Not an explosion. Just a sound, quiet, cruel, and cold. It lasted less than 30 seconds. Eleanor stirred slightly in her bed. She had just dozed off. The sensation was strange, like a distant sigh traveling through the ship's body. A faint vibration. The kind of feeling you question in dreams. Her husband sat up, blinking into the dim light. "Did you feel that?" he asked softly. "Yes," she replied. It felt strange. Like something passing by. Neither of them moved. The ship was silent again. The engines continued. The vibration faded. It was nothing like the disasters described in novels, no jolt, no chaos, no obvious harm. Elsewhere, others noticed too. A steward paused in the hallway. A crewman stood up from his bunk. The band in the lounge stopped playing for a moment, exchanged glances, then resumed. A few passengers stepped out into the corridor in robes and slippers, curious but calm. Below deck, some of the crew had felt the scrape more directly. In the forward compartments, water had begun to flow in, icy and fast, but silent. The bulkheads, so carefully designed, began their work. The ship's heart had been pierced. But above, no one knew. At 11:50 p.m., passengers were still in bed. Still drifting between wakefulness and dreams. The stars had not changed. The sea remained unnaturally still. The cold bit deeper, yet the ship sailed on as if nothing had happened. No sirens. No lights. No panic. Just a sense, a soft, strange sense, that something had shifted beneath the surface. At midnight, stewards began to quietly knock on doors. "Just a precaution, sir. Please put on a coat." The words were calm. The tone gentle. Passengers obliged, curious but unworried. Some returned to the deck, now noticing the ship had slowed. Eleanor wrapped a scarf around her neck, stepped outside with her husband into the night air. "It's colder," she whispered. He nodded. "And look, they've stopped the engines." They stood together beneath the stars. The sea around them shone black and still. The ship's lights glowed golden, casting long reflections on the water. There was no alarm. Not yet. Only a pause. A breath held. As if time itself had stopped. The Titanic, so strong, so sure, now rested quietly in the middle of the Atlantic. Wounded, but unaware of how deep the wound would run. And aboard her, thousands still dreamed. Still believed in the morning. Still trusted the calm. The silence held. For now. It was now 1 a.m. The stars above burned brighter than ever, and the sea below still lay flat and gleaming like blackened glass. The Titanic, proud and glowing, continued to sit quietly upon the ocean, dignified even as water crept steadily into her core. On the boat deck, the air had turned brutally cold. A light frost clung to the wooden railings and steel davits. The lifeboats, now being lowered one by one, creaked softly as they descended into the black waters below. Every motion, every sound, was carried across the open stillness. It was as though the ocean itself was listening. Eleanor stood among a quiet group near Lifeboat 6. Women, wrapped in cloaks and furs, murmured prayers or remained silent. Children nestled into their mothers' arms, their small faces pale with cold and confusion. No one screamed. No one ran. It was a strange kind of order, not because people weren't afraid, but because fear had not yet fully taken hold. Her husband remained beside her. Officers were now more insistent, though still gentle. "Women and children only," they said. "Quickly now, we must be swift." But Eleanor hesitated. "How can I leave you?" she whispered. He looked down at her and took her gloved hand. "You must," he said quietly. "You have to." Around them, others were facing the same moment. Married couples standing together. Elderly parents with grown children. No one wanted to be separated, yet they understood. The sea waited. The ship would not. Lifeboat 6 rocked gently as it took on passengers. The officer at the bow nodded. "We're ready." Eleanor clutched her husband's arm one last time, then allowed herself to be helped into the boat. She sat between two strangers, her eyes never leaving his face. He offered a soft smile and a wave. Then, slowly, the boat descended, down and down, into the shadows. The ship's white hull loomed silently above them, stretching impossibly high into the stars. The water around the boat lapped gently, noiseless and black. From this lower place, Eleanor could see the Titanic more fully. Her lights still glowed from every deck. Figures lined the railings now. Some waved. Some watched. Some simply stood. The enormity of it, the silence, the calm, the dreadful beauty, sank deep into her soul. Behind her, a woman wept quietly. Ahead, the oars dipped into the water, soft and rhythmic, pulling the lifeboat farther from the ship. The cold bit harder now, no longer softened by the shelter of the decks. Eleanor wrapped her arms tightly around her coat, still not quite believing what was happening. Back aboard the Titanic, her husband returned to the promenade. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers and stared out into the darkness. Around him, other men stood in quiet clusters. Some spoke in low voices. Others simply waited. They all knew, now. Below them, water had reached the grand staircase's lower level. In the boiler rooms, men worked still, keeping the generators alive so that the lights might shine until the end. The wireless operators, exhausted, continued to send out calls, "Come at once. We are sinking." Out on the sea, the lifeboats began to drift. Some clung together. Others floated alone. From her seat, Eleanor saw the ship from afar for the first time. How tall it still was, how strong it still looked. And yet, she saw the tilt. Just barely, a slant forward, down toward the bow. The ship was beginning to dip. She closed her eyes. Not in panic, but in sorrow. By 1:30 a.m., the decks grew fuller. The final lifeboats were being filled. Officers no longer asked. They ordered. There was no more room for hesitation. Time was slipping away. Still, many would not go. Couples chose to stay together. Elderly passengers refused to leave their sons. Some men tried to board and were turned away. Others stepped back willingly. "There's no more room," an officer said. "She can't hold any more." And so the last boat was lowered. The cries began only after it was gone. As the lifeboats moved farther from the Titanic, Eleanor could hear it, voices rising behind them. Still distant. Still muffled. But growing. A new sound entered the still night, the sound of farewell. And yet, in that final hour before chaos, there remained something sacred. The ship stood tall in the water, lit like a floating city, surrounded by stars and shadows. Those still aboard waited with quiet strength. The orchestra played gently, a waltz drifting over the sea. Not to mask fear, but to offer peace. And Eleanor, floating far below in the dark water, listened. She listened to the music, to the voices, to the ship, the mighty Titanic, holding on to her dignity in the face of the end. The stars above watched. The sea below held its breath. And all the world seemed wrapped in a dream. It was 2 a.m. The Titanic now leaned forward with a quiet, unmistakable grace. From the lifeboats scattered across the sea, the tilt of the ship became more pronounced. What once seemed like a slight slant had grown into a clear downward angle. The bow was deeper in the water. The stern lifted ever so slightly toward the heavens. And yet the lights still burned. Golden, soft, and strangely calm, they illuminated the decks, the windows, and the souls who remained. It was as if the ship refused to go dark before her time. Like a candle holding out against the wind. In Lifeboat 6, Eleanor huddled beside the other women. Ice had begun to form on their coats. The cold was no longer something they could ignore. It bit into their skin, settled in their bones. But no one complained. All eyes remained fixed on the Titanic, on its silent struggle against the sea. Some of the lifeboats floated far apart, like drifting stars. Others tried to stay together, their oars moving in slow unison. There was no clear plan. Just distance. Cold. And helpless watching. Back on board, the decks had emptied, not from panic, but from surrender. Many now waited on the aft section, the stern, where the elevation was higher. Men and women, strangers and lovers, stood close together. Some sat on deck chairs. Others knelt quietly in prayer. An elderly couple held hands. A young steward helped an older passenger sit more comfortably, offering his own coat. They all knew the truth now. At the stern rail, Eleanor's husband gripped the cold steel. He could see his breath, feel the deck beneath him shift and groan. He looked out over the ocean and found the lifeboats, tiny, swaying, scattered. He wondered if she was safe. He whispered her name into the wind. Somewhere, far below, Eleanor closed her eyes. The music still played. Faint but beautiful. The same gentle waltz, Songe d'automne, perhaps, or nearer, my God, to thee, no one could say for certain. But it was real. Carried over still water and open sky. At 2:10 a.m., the lights flickered for the first time. A slight pulse. Then steadied again. Below deck, the engineers worked in darkness and water, their boots submerged, their hands numb. They had kept the power alive for as long as humanly possible, not for survival, but for hope. For those who still needed light in the dark. 2 minutes later, the ship groaned louder. Metal twisted deep within its body. A sound both ancient and mechanical, as if the earth itself were sighing. Then the lights blinked again. Once. Twice. And then they went out. A silence fell that was deeper than before. The music stopped. The glow was gone. The Titanic, for the first time since leaving Southampton, stood in complete darkness. Only her silhouette remained, a black shadow rising from the sea, framed by stars. Gasps echoed from the lifeboats. A few cries. And then. A soft rumble. The bow, now fully submerged, pulled the ship downward. The stern rose into the sky, high and higher, exposing its massive propellers, still glistening. People clung to railings. Some slipped. Others jumped. Not out of fear, out of necessity. The ship's final cry rang out, a sound of tearing steel, echoing across the water. And then, slowly, gracefully, she began to break. The midsection buckled. A crack, not thunderous, but deliberate, passed through her spine. And the Titanic, once the greatest ship in the world, split in two. Eleanor watched through frozen tears as the front half disappeared beneath the waves. The rear, still upright, stood for just a moment longer, tall, proud, defiant. And then, in silence, it slid into the sea. Gone. No fire. No explosion. Just the gentle disappearance of a dream. The sea closed around her as if tucking her into sleep. The stars above shimmered on. Eleanor did not scream. No one in the lifeboats did. They just sat, breathless, beneath the vast sky, heart-stunned by what they had seen. The water was quiet again. The night, darker than before. And somewhere deep beneath them, the Titanic lay still. A great ship. A floating city. Now a whispered memory beneath the sea. The Titanic was gone. The mighty ship, the marvel of modern age, now rested beneath miles of ocean. The sea, after consuming her whole, had grown quiet once more, as if nothing had happened at all. Only the stars bore witness now, along with the scattered lifeboats rocking gently upon the icy black waves. It was just past 2:30 a.m. In the silence, a sound rose. Faint at first. Then clearer. Cries. Dozens, then hundreds. From the freezing water, voices called out, some begging, some moaning, some gasping single words. Survivors of the sinking, men and women who had jumped or fallen or been pulled into the cold, now floated in life jackets or clung to pieces of debris. They were close enough to hear. Too far to reach. Eleanor sat upright in Lifeboat 6, her breath clouding in front of her face, her hands trembling. Around her, the others had gone still. The cries were unbearable, piercing and human, filled with suffering. "Help us," someone called from the water. "Please, dear God. Help." But the boat's officer gave no orders to return. "We can't," he said softly. "If we go back, we'll be swamped." The boat was already near capacity. If they rode into the mass of desperate swimmers, they might all be pulled under. So they sat. Listening. The cries became their own kind of tide, rising, falling, rippling through the darkness. Some in the lifeboats wept. Others covered their ears. A few prayed silently into the night. The cold intensified. Frost formed on the edges of Eleanor's shawl. The oars dipped now and then into the black, keeping the boat steady, but they didn't row toward the voices. And the voices began to fade. One by one. Less strength in each call. Some gurgled into silence. Some simply stopped. By 3 a.m., the sea was quiet again. Still. As if no tragedy had occurred. In that surreal stillness, Eleanor finally wept, not loudly, but with quiet sobs that shook her chest. Her tears froze on her cheeks. No one said anything. They all felt the same. Helpless. Hollow. Haunted. In other lifeboats, the story was the same. Some tried to return, like 5th Officer Harold Lowe in Lifeboat 14, who gathered a small group and made the decision to go back after waiting, but most were too afraid, too full, too uncertain. The fear of capsizing hung heavy in every mind. The stars above remained unchanged. The great constellations continued their slow journeys across the heavens. Orion. The Big Dipper. Cassiopeia. Silent, ancient witnesses to this new tragedy. Eleanor looked up at them now. Her thoughts floated between memory and numbness. She thought of her husband, his smile, his last wave. She didn't know if he had jumped, or if he had stood until the very end. She would never know. Somewhere, she felt he was at peace. By 3:30 a.m., the cold began to take its toll. In every lifeboat, people trembled uncontrollably. Some fell into silence, not from calm, but from exhaustion and shock. Children had long since fallen asleep, wrapped in layers of wool and fur. Adults sat rigid, staring into the black, as the distant horizon slowly lightened. Eleanor's limbs ached with chill. Her breath was shallow. She didn't speak. She simply waited. In the distance, a flare shot into the sky. A sudden streak of red against the dark blue. One of the remaining boats had fired a signal. And then, another light. This one, on the horizon. A ship. Tiny, glowing, slowly approaching. A spark of hope in the aftermath. The Carpathia had answered the call. Eleanor leaned forward, squinting through the blur of cold and tears. The ship was still far, hours away, perhaps, but it was real. A rescue. A warmth on the edge of all this loss. Around her, others stirred. Hope returned, quiet and fragile, like the first hint of dawn. The voices in the water had gone silent. But the sea had not forgotten. It would hold the story. And soon, so would the world. At first, the approaching lights were like tiny stars on the horizon. Distant and flickering. But gradually, unmistakably, they grew brighter. Larger. A ship. A real ship. It was around 4 a.m. now. The sun still hadn't risen, but the eastern sky had begun to shift. Midnight blue faded into pale silver. The first signs of morning were reaching across the ocean, brushing the waves with light. Eleanor's lifeboat sat still upon the water. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes were fixed on the approaching vessel. The Carpathia. She had answered the distress calls, steaming through the night, faster than she had ever been pushed. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, had changed course as soon as the Titanic's wireless messages were received. His crew had prepared blankets, soup, and warm rooms. But he had not expected this. He had not expected the Titanic to be gone. At 4:30 a.m., as the first gentle rays of dawn touched the lifeboats, the Carpathia reached the scattered survivors. The sea was calm, unnaturally calm, as if the ocean itself were in mourning. Crewmen leaned over her rails, searching the waters. And then they began to lower ropes. One by one, lifeboats came alongside. Women and children were lifted gently, one after another. Shivering hands reached up. Warm arms pulled them in. Hot drinks were passed. Blankets wrapped. Names were asked and softly spoken. "Where's your husband? Did your child make it? Are you alone?" The questions were simple but heavy. Eleanor felt her knees nearly buckle as she stepped onto the Carpathia's deck. She was helped by a steward, then guided toward a warm room. The shock had settled deep in her muscles. She barely felt the heat at first. But her hands began to thaw. Her lips stopped trembling. Her mind returned. Around her, survivors sat on benches or curled up on the floor. Some wept openly. Others stared ahead, their gazes hollow and stunned. A steward gave her tea. She clutched the cup tightly, as though it might keep her anchored. The Carpathia's crew moved quickly and gently. There were no harsh voices. No loud commands. Just kindness. Soft words. Steady hands. The kind of comfort that only comes after great loss. As more lifeboats arrived, the crowd grew. Children were reunited with mothers. Strangers comforted strangers. Stories began to surface. I saw the ship break in half. They were still playing music as it went down. I saw him on the deck. He wouldn't leave. I don't know where she went. The Carpathia's captain stood on the bridge, looking out over the ocean. Icebergs floated silently in the morning light, vast, white, ominous. He knew now what had happened. And he knew what had to be done. By 8 a.m., the Carpathia had taken aboard all the survivors. Over 700 souls. Each one changed. Each one carrying a story that would never be fully told. Eleanor stood at the rail now, her eyes cast toward the sea. Behind them, empty lifeboats bobbed gently. Below them, far below, the Titanic rested, broken and still. The sun had risen fully, casting a golden light across the waves. The world looked calm again. But Eleanor knew. Everyone on board knew. The calmness hid something deeper. A story of bravery. Of mistakes. Of sacrifice and sorrow. The morning sea was eerily calm, like a mirror holding the pale sky. From the deck of the Carpathia, there was no sign of the Titanic. No black smoke rising. No wreckage drifting. Only the scattered silence of the Atlantic and the exhausted faces of those who survived. Eleanor stood wrapped in a thick woolen coat that didn't belong to her. A steward had given it to her after she was brought aboard. The coat was too large and smelled faintly of tobacco and salt, but it was warm. She leaned quietly against the railing and looked out at the soft gray water. Her fingers gripped the edge. She was not alone on the deck. Survivors gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices or standing in complete silence. Some clutched photos or belongings. Some simply stared at the horizon. The grief was not loud, it was too fresh, too vast. It hung in the air like a fog. There was no panic now. No screams. Just quiet. A quiet so profound it seemed to echo. Below deck, others rested. Some had collapsed from exhaustion. Some wept softly in the dark. Some had not yet spoken a word since boarding. The trauma ran deep. Words had not yet returned to all lips. The Carpathia's crew moved respectfully. Gentle movements, soft voices. They brought hot broth, bread, warm drinks. Blankets were placed over shoulders. Some survivors refused food. Some could only sip. But the effort was constant. Captain Rostron, tall and solemn, moved among the passengers himself, offering presents, if not answers. He knew this tragedy would follow them all for the rest of their lives. Eleanor hadn't yet been able to write her husband's name on the passenger list posted near the salon. The list was for survivors. She had written only her own name, her hands shaking. She still didn't know the full fate of so many friends, or even if some had survived in another lifeboat. Rumors swirled gently, this person seen, that person lost. But nothing was certain. As the day wore on, clouds gathered in the sky. A light rain fell briefly, as if the heavens themselves had paused in mourning. Eleanor walked the deck alone for a time, her mind lost in thoughts. Images flashed in and out, the grand staircase, the crystal chandeliers, the laughter in the dining room, the music of the quartet, the tilt of the deck, the cold black water. And her husband. The way he had smiled. The calm in his voice. She had no final words from him, but she remembered the way he had looked at her before they were separated. There had been love in that look. She would carry it with her. By the afternoon, the Carpathia turned its course toward New York. The decision had been made. There was no need to search for more. The sea had taken the rest. The ship moved slowly through the water, like a silent procession. A funeral without music, with lifeboats lashed on deck as grim reminders of what had been lost. Inside, a minister led a quiet service. No hymns were sung, but a prayer was spoken. Heads were bowed. Tears were shed. There was no need to mention names. Everyone knew. By sunset, the survivors had begun forming new bonds. Women held hands. Children curled into the arms of strangers. Silent comfort passed between them, the kind only those who had survived together could offer. Eleanor shared a blanket with an older woman who had lost her son. Neither spoke for hours. They simply sat side by side and let the motion of the ship soothe them. The stars came out again that night. Bright and sharp against the dark. In a quiet room aboard the Carpathia, Eleanor sat at a small writing desk. The lamp beside her flickered gently with the ship's motion. The walls creaked softly, as if whispering memories back to her. Around her, others were writing too, to mothers, to sons, to husbands, to fiancés. Letters home. Letters of survival. Letters of loss. Eleanor's hand trembled as she touched pen to paper. She hadn't written since boarding. Her mind had been frozen, her thoughts blurred. But now, a need rose within her, to speak, to remember, to preserve. The letter began simply. My dearest Thomas. She paused. He would never read it. But she needed to write it. I remember your hand holding mine as we stood on the deck. I remember how calm you were, even as everything trembled around us. I remember your eyes, full of love, even as you told me to go. The pen scratched gently, softly, like a memory being carved into the quiet. They brought us aboard the Carpathia. The crew is kind. The other women. We hold on to one another like sisters now. I wear someone else's coat, and I cannot stop shaking. But I am alive. And I carry you in every breath I take. She looked out the small window. Night again. The sea no longer frightened her. It seemed gentler now, somehow, tired, perhaps. Even the waves seemed to mourn. The wind was less sharp. The letter continued. I will return to New York alone, but I will carry your name, your voice, your warmth. I don't yet know what comes next. But I promise you, I will live with grace. For both of us. Her tears smudged the ink, but she did not stop. You once told me that stars are the stories of those who came before us. I will look for you there, every night. She signed her name. Folded the paper. And held it close. Elsewhere on the ship, a boy read aloud from a crumpled page he'd found in his coat, a poem his father had written, now made sacred by loss. An elderly man held a locket to his lips. A young woman with bare feet whispered prayers into the dark. So many goodbyes, unspoken. So many moments unfinished. The Carpathia sailed on. Day and night blurred into one long, quiet passage. The ship was full, yet still silent. Grief does not shout, it sits gently, curling itself around the soul. Each survivor carried a weight. Some carried names they could not forget. Some carried guilt they could not name. Some, like Eleanor, carried love, vast and wordless, that would live on in every quiet breath. In a corner near the stairwell, a steward had set up a small board with names pinned to it. Survivors checked it daily. Sometimes, there was a cry of relief. Sometimes, only silence. Eleanor added one more page to the board. A single sheet of paper. On it, the names of those she remembered. Those she'd spoken with. Danced beside. Dined next to. Watched walk bravely into the night. No titles. No drama. Just names. A tribute. As the ship moved closer to New York, the survivors began to prepare, not for a new life, but for the world that would meet them. A world that hadn't seen what they had seen. That would ask questions they weren't ready to answer. The unsent letters would stay with them. In suitcases, in pockets, in trembling hands. It was early morning when the Carpathia reached the harbor of New York. A soft mist rolled over the water, clinging to the shoreline like a veil. The ship moved slowly, solemnly, escorted by tugboats and silence. The skyline of the city loomed ahead, familiar yet distant, like a place from another life. Eleanor stood near the bow, surrounded by others who had shared the same nightmare. They did not speak. They only watched. The Statue of Liberty came into view through the fog, its outline blurred by the pale light. It felt almost surreal, as though they were stepping from one world into another. Crowds had gathered at the docks. Hundreds, maybe thousands. People waiting with newspapers clutched in their hands, their faces drawn with worry. Reporters, family members, strangers, all waiting for the names, the faces, the truth. Some waved. Some called out. Some simply stared. As the Carpathia docked, the survivors began to disembark in small, gentle waves. Crew members helped them down the gangway. Reporters stepped forward eagerly, only to be held back by a wall of police and crew. There would be time for stories later. Now was the time for return. Eleanor clutched the borrowed coat tightly as she stepped onto solid ground. The dock was cold and wet from the morning mist. Her legs trembled, unsteady after so many days at sea. There were voices everywhere, shouting names, asking questions, calling out in hope or heartbreak. A man beside her dropped to his knees when he saw his daughter. A woman fainted when her husband did not appear. Eleanor moved past it all slowly, almost weightlessly, as if still floating. At a corner near the exit, a volunteer handed her a small cup of coffee. Another offered her a place to sit, a blanket, a notebook. She nodded in thanks, but said nothing. Her heart ached in her chest, heavy with the names she could not speak. One by one, survivors were escorted to waiting rooms, hospitals, shelters, or the arms of loved ones. For those who had no one, the city opened its doors, churches, hotels, community halls. The people of New York came forward, offering whatever they could, clothes, food, silence. Eleanor was taken to a quiet hotel on West 57th Street. A woman from the relief committee walked with her, arm in arm, as if they had always known each other. The room was small, but warm. There was a single bed, a basin of water, and a small vase with white flowers. A newspaper lay folded on the desk. The headline in bold, Titanic lost, 1,500 feared dead. Eleanor didn't open it. Instead, she sat by the window, looking out at the street below. Horses pulled wagons, children ran past with bread in their arms, people hurried through the fog, unaware of the ocean's fresh wound. Everything looked normal. And yet, nothing would ever be again. That night, she bathed, changed into a clean nightgown given to her by the Red Cross, and lay beneath the soft covers. The silence of the room was complete, no creaking wood, no rushing water, no cries in the dark. Just the quiet hum of a sleeping city. She reached beneath her pillow and touched the folded letter she had written. A whisper passed her lips. "Good night, my love." Outside, the stars shone dimly behind the clouds. Not as bright as they had been above the Atlantic, but still there. Waiting, like gentle sentinels of memory. In the days that followed, the city slowly returned to its rhythm, though something had shifted, deeply and silently. The Titanic's name was now on every street corner, every newspaper, every conversation whispered in cafes or murmured in hallways. But for Eleanor and the others, the noise outside was a stark contrast to the stillness within. She remained at the quiet hotel on West 57th Street, tucked away from the growing public storm. Reporters came daily, asking for quotes, for tears, for drama. She said nothing. Instead, she wrote. Her journal pages began to fill. Not with tragedy, but with the things she wished to remember, the feel of the sea breeze on that first night, the music in the first-class lounge, the kindness of strangers, and the way Thomas had kissed her forehead just before letting go. She began to walk the nearby blocks, wrapped in her donated coat. People didn't recognize her. She looked like any other widow, any other soul weathered by sorrow. Each morning, she stopped by the church a few streets over. Inside, there were candles and flowers placed in quiet memory. Survivors came and went, leaving notes in a simple wooden box marked Remembrance. One day, Eleanor placed her letter to Thomas inside. No address. No name. Just the truth of her heart sealed away. Across the city, memorial services were held. Names were read aloud in long, somber tones, the rich and the poor, the known and the unknown. It didn't matter now. The sea had made them equal. The Astor family donated to hospitals. Orphans were taken in. Fundraisers were held in concert halls and school auditoriums. Ships in the harbor flew flags at half-mast. Even the toughest dock workers paused for moments of silence. But beneath the public mourning, private lives were unraveling, changed forever. Some survivors found it impossible to sleep. Some refused to sail again. Some never spoke of the voyage again, choosing instead to bury it quietly beneath years of silence. Eleanor tried to find her way through the days like stepping through fog. She didn't return to her former home. It didn't feel like hers anymore. Instead, she began volunteering at a small hospital, helping those who had no families left. She read to them. Listened. Sat quietly beside their beds as they wept in their sleep. When someone asked why she had come, she simply replied. I've been carried. Now I carry. One afternoon, she visited the Cunard Line's office. There, a wall had been set up with lists of passengers, survivors and the lost. She ran her fingers slowly down the page, stopping at names she knew. Faces from meals, from music rooms, from the cold deck under the stars. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, one name at a time, like a roll call of memory. In the final days of April, spring began to bloom in the city. Trees softened with blossoms. The air warmed. And for the first time in weeks, Eleanor stepped out without her borrowed coat. She walked to Central Park, sat on a bench near the pond, and listened to the birds. Children's laughter echoed from across the water. Life, as always, was beginning again. But within her, the stillness remained. Not heavy. Not painful. Just quiet. Back in her small hotel room, Eleanor sat by the window as dusk painted the sky in soft lavender and gray. The city below was alive with footsteps, voices, and carriage wheels clattering on cobblestones. But inside, the quiet was deep and uninterrupted, a gentle cocoon of thought and memory. She had taken up the habit of writing letters each evening. Some were addressed to people who had been lost on the Titanic, Thomas, of course, but also Mrs. Dunsley from her table in the dining saloon, the steward who had brought her tea on the first morning, and even the young boy with the wooden toy boat. The letters were never mailed. They were folded neatly, tied with a thin blue ribbon, and placed inside a small box beneath her bed. A box of remembrance, of unspoken farewells. In her letter to Thomas that night, she wrote. The stars are quiet here, hidden behind city lights, but I still look for them. I think of you often, not in grief now, but with a strange kind of peace. You were my lighthouse in that dark water, my last warm breath on a cold night. I wonder if you hear me, if you see the candles we light. As she set down her pen, Eleanor reached for a small envelope that had arrived earlier that day. It was from the White Star Line, a formal letter expressing condolences, offering financial support for survivors, and listing a number of possessions recovered from the wreckage. Inside was a small slip of paper with Thomas's name on it. Only one item had been returned, a silver pocket watch, found in the inner pocket of his coat, still ticking when they pulled it from the sea. The steward who'd retrieved it had reportedly kept it wound, out of respect, they said, until it could be returned. Eleanor held the watch in her hands. It was cold, smooth, and heavier than she remembered. The ticking was faint now, as though it had learned to whisper rather than speak. She closed her eyes and pressed it to her heart. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was a comfort, like a heartbeat echoing from far away. Later that week, she took a carriage ride to the waterfront. The docks were busy with loading crates, stevedores shouting, and seagulls circling above like echoes of some far-off world. Ships whistled, ropes strained, the Atlantic waited beyond. She stood at the edge, looking out to where sea met sky. There was no ceremony. No great act. She simply opened her hands and let the silver watch fall into the waves. It sank quickly, disappearing beneath the foam with barely a ripple. Eleanor stood there for a long while. She remembered the dark sea that had taken so much, but also the stars above it, the quiet bravery of strangers, the sound of music in the dark, and the warmth of a final kiss. She turned away from the water and walked back into the city. The watch was gone now, but its rhythm had stayed behind. Within her. Quiet. Steady. Eternal. Years passed. The world turned and changed, as it always does. New wars would come, new ships would sail, and new names would fill the papers. But for Eleanor, time moved more softly. More deliberately. Like the slow roll of a tide. She never remarried. Not out of mourning, but out of contentment. What she had shared with Thomas, brief though it was, had left a lasting calm in her soul. Something deeper than romance. Something sacred. Eleanor moved to a quiet town by the sea in Maine. A cottage with white shutters and a porch that overlooked the cliffs. The kind of place where waves were constant companions, and gulls called overhead like memories on wings. Her days were gentle. She took up gardening, painting, and kept a small collection of books, many of them water-stained survivors from the past, others found in second-hand shops with forgotten inscriptions. Her nights, though, remained the most sacred time of all. That was when the dreams came. Not nightmares. But soft visitations, the kind that felt more like memories than imagination. She would dream of the Titanic, not in the panic of its final hours, but in its golden peace. The great ship, sailing under stars, steady and proud across the Atlantic. She would walk its halls again, run her fingers along the polished railings, hear the music drifting through its corridors. The grand staircase gleamed. The chandeliers sparkled. Sometimes she would see Thomas. Not always. But often enough. He would be sitting at a table in the cafe, smiling gently, sipping tea. Or standing by the rail on the promenade deck, coat buttoned, hat in hand. He never spoke in these dreams. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. One morning, Eleanor awoke before dawn. The sea was calm, the sky a soft canvas of pearl and rose. She made herself tea and stepped onto the porch with a woolen shawl over her shoulders. The ocean before her stretched endless and blue. Somewhere out there, beneath miles of water, the Titanic rested. Not as a grave, but as a quiet monument, to human hope, to courage, to love found and lost, to the fragility of things thought unsinkable. She often thought of it not as a tragedy, but as a reminder. That we are all ships, crossing dark oceans, unsure of what lies ahead. And that in the end, what matters is not the storm, but the lights we hold within us, the kindness, the connection, the memory. Eleanor lived to a peaceful old age. When she passed, quietly in her sleep, she was buried on a hill not far from the sea. Her stone was simple. No dates, no accolades. Just her name, and below it, the words. She carried the light. And perhaps, somewhere in the great stillness of the Atlantic, the Titanic remains not only in pieces of steel and salt, but in stories. In dreams. In hearts like Eleanor's, who endured, remembered, and loved. Softly. Steadily. Forever.